You're listening ad-free on Wondery Plus.
On Sunday, September 18th, 1994, Jennifer Thompson went to the county fair for the fourth day in a row. Growing up in the tiny town of Orofino, Idaho, not much usually happened. So 14-year-old Jen wasn't about to waste the most exciting days of the year. Back on Thursday, Jen and her friends had gone on all the rides from the carousel to the Ferris wheel, and then on Friday they went to the county livestock auction, and Saturday was the parade, and now on Sunday they had already watched the log cutting competition, and as they had, they totally gorged themselves on every kind of food the fair had to offer. Corn dogs, funnel cakes, cotton candy, caramel apples, and also all the soda they could drink. Now it was time to go home, and Jen was feeling completely full, like she had just eaten an entire Thanksgiving dinner. Still though, she and her friends each bought one more corn dog for the road, before taking one last walk around the fairgrounds and saying their goodbyes. When Jen got home, her dad Dennis was on the phone, and her mom Sherry was busy making dinner. So Jen just went upstairs to her bedroom. She had a bunch of homework she needed to finish before school on Monday. Jen liked school sports a lot more than school work, but she was in 8th grade now, and she didn't want to fall behind. So she grabbed her math assignments out of her backpack and worked on equations until her mom called her for dinner. Jen made her way downstairs and sat down at the dining room table. Her mom had made one of Jen's favorite meals, chicken and rice casserole. But after all that junk food at the county fair, Jen really didn't have an appetite. So she mostly picked at her plate and told her parents all about her day at the fair, and about how sad she was that it was now over. After dinner, Jen's mom asked Jen if she wanted any dessert, and despite her very full belly, Jen said yes. And so before long, Jen was crushing a big bowl of vanilla ice cream, and then afterwards, she helped her parents clean up before she went back upstairs to her bedroom. Once there, she finished her homework, and then just went to bed early. She wanted to be well rested for school the next day. When Jen's alarm went off in the morning, she dragged herself out of bed and shuffled into the bathroom. But when she turned on the light, a sudden sharp pain shot through her stomach. She doubled over and grabbed the bathroom counter to keep from falling down. For a second, Jen felt like she was about to throw up, but she breathed through the pain, and slowly the cramp sort of went away. Jen released her grip on the counter and straightened up again. She stood for a moment, afraid the pain might come back, but everything seemed okay. Jen told herself that most likely she had just eaten too much at the fair and she was still feeling it today, and so she just went back to getting ready for school. After brushing her teeth, Jen got dressed and slid the math homework from last night into her backpack. Then she zipped up the bag, slung it over one shoulder, and started going downstairs. But about halfway down the steps, another sharp shooting pain cut through Jen's abdomen, and this did not feel like any sort of normal bellyache she had ever had. It felt more like something was trying to tear its way out of her stomach. Jen dropped her backpack and kind of hunched forward, clutching at her stomach. The next thing Jen knew, her mom was at the foot of the stairs, looking up at her with a mixture of confusion and concern on her face. Jen barely had time to tell her mom that she was in pain and feeling sick, before suddenly a big wave of nausea hit her, and she had to run back upstairs to the bathroom, where she vomited and also had diarrhea. A few moments later, Jen's mom, who had gone upstairs as well, knocked softly on the bathroom door and asked Jen if she was okay. Jen called out no and said she felt absolutely horrible. She said something was definitely wrong with her stomach. Through the door, Jen's mother suggested that Jen stay home from school that day. Jen was relieved, but was too nauseous to reply. When Jen's father, Dennis, got home from working at a local car dealership that evening, he went straight upstairs to check on his daughter. Sherry had told him that Jen was having a lot of stomach pain, and both parents agreed that the 4 days of crushing sugar and fried foods at the county fair was very likely responsible for this pain. But when Dennis walked into Jen's bedroom, he was shocked by how miserable she looked. Her face was red and her hair was damp with sweat. Jen told him she'd been throwing up and having diarrhea all day. Her stomach ached when she was lying down, but it hurt even worse when she was standing up. And some of the cramps were so intense, Jen said they made her cry. Dennis brushed a strand of hair out of his daughter's face, then said he was going to get her a glass of water. When he went downstairs, Sherry was waiting in the kitchen, and she would tell him that the only thing Jen had been able to stomach all day was just a few bites of ice cream, and she had been running a low-grade fever for hours. Both parents were very concerned now, but they weren't quite sure what to do. They knew their daughter absolutely hated going to the doctor, and so they agreed that, maybe now was not quite the time to take her yet. For now, Dennis and Sherry decided they would just continue giving their daughter water and Tylenol and check on her throughout the evening. Eventually, despite all her discomfort, Jen would fall asleep, and after she did, Dennis went to bed hopeful that his daughter would feel better soon. 2 days later, on Wednesday morning, Dennis got out of bed and walked upstairs to his daughter's room. But when he went inside, Jen barely stirred. She'd hardly eaten anything for 2 days, but still her stomach cramps had only gotten more painful and more frequent, and she was still running a fever, she was still vomiting, and she was still having diarrhea. Dennis knelt next to his daughter's bed and shook her shoulder until she slowly blinked awake. Then he told his daughter he had bad news. She clearly was not improving, so he and her mother had decided it was time now to go to the doctor. Jen groaned, but she didn't put up a fight, and to Dennis this was actually a bad sign. His daughter was clearly so sick that she wasn't even trying to avoid the doctor. Dennis helped Jen get out of her bed and let her hold onto his arm for stability as they made their way down the stairs and out to the car. Then Dennis backed out of the driveway and headed to their usual family medicine clinic. A few minutes later, Dennis helped Jen climb onto an exam table, and he could tell she was struggling just to sit upright. Before long, Jen's longtime pediatrician, Lyndon Bishop, came into the room, and he was surprised to see his athletic, young patient looking so ill. He listened closely as Dennis explained his daughter's symptoms, and all the while, Jen just silently sat there, clutching her stomach and leaning forward. Dennis told Dr. Bishop that he was pretty sure his daughter had food poisoning from something she must have eaten at the county fair. But when the doctor gave Jen a quick physical examination, he said that he thought Dennis was actually wrong, that this was something else. Because he said, food poisoning usually only lasts for 1 to 2 days, and Jen had been in pain for over 3 days. And so Dennis was taken aback by this, but he understood the logic. Dr. Bishop asked Jen if she had any history of stomach pain. Her father was about to answer for her, but then Jen lifted her head up and said yes in a weak voice. But that was all she could manage to say before she had to slump forward again. At this point, Dennis stepped in and he explained that not long ago, Jen had suffered from debilitating cramps in her lower abdomen for seemingly no obvious reason. Dennis and Sherry had taken their daughter to a gynecologist who found that one of Jen's ovaries was swollen to 3 times its normal size. Fortunately, this swelling was not cancerous, and eventually Jen's cramps had just kind of gone away on their own. Dennis admitted that, when Jen first got sick after the county fair, he didn't even think about her swollen ovary because her illness was so much worse this time. He didn't think a swollen ovary could give his daughter symptoms like a fever, diarrhea, and vomiting. But Dr. Bishop said he did think it was possible. Maybe Jen was ovulating, and that caused the swelling to return, and her symptoms came back even worse than before. It was the best and really only theory they had for now. So Jen was ultimately sent home with strict instructions to come back if the pain got any worse. Dennis was disappointed there wasn't more they could do for the moment, but he trusted Dr. Bishop's judgment, so he helped Jen off the exam table and walked her back out to the car. He leaned the passenger seat all the way back so Jen could lie down, and then as they drove home, Jen curled into the fetal position and began moaning. It made Dennis feel terrible to see his daughter suffer so badly when he really couldn't do anything to help her. But he reminded himself what Dr. Bishop had said right before they left. Don't worry, Jen will feel better soon. Later that evening, Dennis tucked his shivering daughter into bed. Sherry had gone out of town to visit the couple's other daughter. Dennis was going to be holding down the fort by himself along with Jen, and so far everything seemed to be okay. At least Jen was resting. Dennis put on his pajamas, brushed his teeth, and climbed into bed to watch TV, but as soon as he turned it on, he heard his daughter screaming, so he jumped out of bed and sprinted to Jen's room. When he got there, he found his daughter lying on the floor, curled up into a ball with tears streaming down her face. Jen kept screaming that she'd never felt anything that hurt this badly. She said she literally felt like she was going to die. In a total panic, Dennis ran back downstairs to the living room. He grabbed the phone and called the nearest emergency room. A receptionist answered and patched him through to a nurse, and Dennis explained what was happening, and the nurse paged Dr. Bishop, and he responded immediately, saying, "You know what? It sounds like Jen has appendicitis." The nurse told Dennis to bring his daughter to the emergency room immediately. In severe appendicitis cases, the appendix can burst open inside the body, causing complications and even death. And so if Jen had acute appendicitis, then she would need surgery to remove her appendix as soon as possible. By the time they made it to the hospital about 20 minutes later, Jen was barely coherent. Dennis lifted her out of the passenger seat and carried her into the emergency room. Under the bright fluorescent lights, he could see that his daughter's face was bright red and drenched in sweat. As soon as Dennis approached the check-in desk with his daughter in his arms, the receptionist called for the nurse who he'd spoken to on the phone. Within moments, the nurse and other members of the hospital staff loaded Jen onto a gurney, and Dennis followed as they wheeled his daughter into a nearby exam room. The nurse began taking Jen's vital signs and saw that she had a fever, she was severely dehydrated, and her pulse was distressingly high. The nurse began to explain to Dennis what his daughter's vital signs could mean, but then a short man wearing glasses and a white coat entered the room. He introduced himself as Dr. Maurice Mazer, and he'd already been briefed up on Jen's condition, so he went straight to her bedside and began examining her. He began to press lightly on the lower right-hand side of Jen's abdomen to check her appendix. The doctor's prodding seemed to wake Jen up, and she began to cry out in pain and tried to push the doctor away. Dr. Mazer said that it did look like Jen had appendicitis. This would explain her extreme abdominal pain, her fever, and her confusion. The doctor said the only treatment was an emergency operation to remove her appendix, like right now. But as Dr. Mazer reviewed Jen's medical charts, he told her father that something didn't look right to him. Jen's white blood cell count, her body's natural defense, was going down. The doctor said the number of those cells should be soaring right now as Jen's body fought off this appendicitis. Dr. Mazer said the drop could mean two things. Either her infection was getting better, which seemed very unlikely based on how sick Jen still appeared, or her appendicitis was getting so severe that it was overwhelming her natural defenses. And so Dr. Mazer told Dennis that bottom line, he believed Jen's appendix needed to be removed immediately. Otherwise, his daughter's life could be in danger. Dennis looked at Jen, who looked absolutely terrified. Tears filled her eyes as she said she didn't want to have surgery. But all Dennis could do was promise her that she would feel better when it was all over. And then he gave his daughter a gentle hug before the nurses took her away to be prepped for surgery. Jen's mother, Sherry, returned from visiting her other daughter just in time to find Dennis sitting in the hospital waiting room. The couple spent the next hour waiting on the edge of their seats until finally Dr. Mazer entered the waiting room and sat down beside them. Right away, the doctor said Jen's surgery had gone smoothly and she was okay, but then Dr. Mazer frowned. He explained that while Jen's appendix did show modest signs of infection, it wasn't nearly bad enough to cause the agony she had been going through. The parents were confused. Their daughter had been rushed into emergency surgery to remove her appendix, but now that that was done, it sounded like it might not have been necessary. But Dr. Mazer, who was sensing this in the parents, assured them that they'd actually done the right thing, because during the course of this operation, Dr. Mazer had discovered something very unsettling about Jen. Jen's whole intestinal tract looked red and inflamed, and Dr. Mazer didn't know why. And so, in short, because of this operation, it was discovered that Jen's appendix was not badly infected. However, the rest of her digestive system was. And so Dr. Mazer said he hoped Jen would feel better now that her appendix was out, but he just wasn't sure if that had really done anything to fix the issue. Dennis and Sherry turned to each other in amazement. Neither of them were comforted by the idea that Jen might or might not feel better. It sounded like she had a dangerous infection that the surgery hadn't really touched. But there was nothing they could do about that now, so Dennis grabbed a magazine off the waiting room table and began to read, doing his best to distract himself until he could see his daughter again. 1,200 miles away at that very moment, A different and yet eerily similar story was playing out in rural Minnesota. A young nurse named Callie Vins was working in a small local medical clinic, and it was totally packed. Normally, it was not her job to check patients in, but there were so many people crammed into the small waiting room that the receptionist needed Callie's help. Callie pushed her short dark hair out of her face, feeling totally overwhelmed. She was an experienced and highly capable nurse, but the past few days had really pushed her to her limit. Dozens of teenagers had come into the clinic with fevers, diarrhea, vomiting, and extreme stomach pains. One of the doctors who worked at this clinic thought the teenagers had the flu, but to Callie, that didn't make any sense. For starters, if this was the flu, then why were only teenagers getting sick? Why not their parents or younger siblings? And why didn't they have runny noses, coughs, or any of the other respiratory symptoms typically associated with the flu? Callie heard the bell above the front door ring as yet another nauseous teenager and their parents stepped inside. Looking around at the waiting room full of sick kids, Callie knew she needed to do something. Whatever was going on here, she did not believe their small clinic was equipped to handle it. Callie turned and told the receptionist that she'd be right back. Then Callie made her way through the crowd of people and into the back of the clinic. At the nurse's station, she pulled out the office phone book and found the number for the Minnesota Department of Health. As soon as a representative answered her call, Callie described the mysterious outbreak in her small rural town. The representative told Callie to collect saliva, urine, and stool samples from all the patients and send them in to the health department for testing. This way, state analysts could try to figure out what was causing this widespread illness. Callie thanked the official and then hung up the phone. As one of the clinic's doctors rushed past her on the way to visit yet another patient, Callie pulled them aside and explained what they needed to do. A couple days later, 14-year-old Jen Thompson was back at home in Orofino, Idaho, lying on the living room couch and watching TV. She'd been released from the hospital, but so far, recovering from her appendectomy had been very difficult. The incision on her lower abdomen was always itchy, her stomach ached constantly, and she could barely keep food down. Plus, on top of that, she'd never been so bored in her life. It had only been a little over a week since she got sick, but she already just felt so isolated. She missed going to softball practice and spending time with her friends. She even missed school, which was something she never thought she'd say. Jen picked up the TV remote and began flipping through the channels trying to find something she wanted to watch. But then suddenly, this sharp, totally overwhelming pain filled her stomach, and it was so intense it made her drop the remote. The pain she was having felt just like the cramps she had had before her surgery. Jen's bottom lip started to tremble. She called out for her dad, and a second later, Dennis rushed into the room. Jen was in so much pain she could barely breathe, let alone talk. But as soon as Dennis walked into the room, she really didn't have to explain anything to him. He could see clearly how much pain his daughter was in, and so a second later he had ran out of the room, got Jen's mother, and got the car keys, and then within minutes, the entire Thompson family was back on the road, heading to the hospital. Less than an hour later, Jen was lying on a hospital bed with Dr. Mazur standing over her. Dr. Mazur pressed lightly on Jen's abdomen and said her incisions seemed to be healing fine. But clearly, something other than appendicitis was making her sick. Dr. Mazur said he was beginning to wonder if maybe Jen was suffering from an infection that was inside of her intestines. So he ordered a stool sample to be tested for a number of different bacteria. The idea of foreign bacteria inside her digestive tract really freaked Jen out, but it wasn't nearly as bad as what Dr. Mazur said next. Bacterial testing would likely take at least 24 hours to complete, and he didn't think they had any time to waste. Dr. Mazur was worried that he'd missed something along the way, so he suggested an exploratory surgery to see if he might be able to determine the source of her illness. Jen had already gone through one surgery, and the idea of being cut open again was almost too much for her to handle. She looked at her parents, wishing they could save her from this. Her mother looked like she was about to cry, while her father was just shaking his head back and forth. But Dennis told the doctor that if another surgery was what they had to do, then that's what they had to do. And deep down, even though Jen did not want to do this surgery, she knew he was right. So, despite Jen's deep anxieties, nurses began prepping her for the operation. They hooked her up to an IV and then cleaned the skin on her belly where the scalpel would cut her open. All the while, Jen felt like she was going to throw up. both from nerves and also from her illness. But just as the nurses were about to wheel Jen back into the operating room, Dr. Mazur came running into the room saying the surgery would not be necessary after all. The hospital lab was not very busy that day, so they'd been able to expedite the stool sample tests, and now he knew the source of Jen's illness. It would turn out Jen's illness was not from her enlarged ovary or from appendicitis. The doctor said she had a potentially deadly microorganism living inside her digestive tract. Now, it most likely came from something she ate, but the doctor said he had no idea what that could be. However, on the positive side, Dr. Mazur said that, while this microorganism was very dangerous, there was a very effective treatment that they could begin right away. As Jen's treatment began, 3 states away, a man named Larry Edmondson was standing in his office at the Minnesota Department of Health, staring at a large map that he'd taped up on his wall. It was a detailed picture of the state of Minnesota, and Larry had stuck a number of red thumbtacks into the map to mark different locations. Larry was leading the investigation into the mysterious disease outbreak in his state. After nurse Callie Vins had called the Minnesota Health Department, Larry and his team had received dozens of biological samples from patients at Callie's clinic. They tested each one, and they too discovered the source of the outbreak. It was the same microorganism that infected Jen in Idaho. But Larry didn't know about Jen. He thought the microorganism was only in Minnesota, and right now he was trying to figure out exactly where it came from. The Minnesota Health Department had continued receiving calls from medical clinics across the state, reporting patients with similar symptoms. Every time Larry got a call, he would send a representative to interview the sick patient and also to collect samples of anything they'd eaten recently. Then Larry put a red thumbtack on the patient's location on the map. He had hoped these red thumbtacks would be more concentrated in one particular area, allowing him to sort of pinpoint the origin of the disease outbreak. But the thumbtacks were spread out in a way that looked totally random. Larry didn't know what to make of this, but he knew that with each passing day, more people were getting sick. While Larry Edmondson puzzled over the Minnesota outbreak, representatives from the Idaho Health Department were digging through Jen Thompson's kitchen. As they did, Jen watched them from her spot on the living room couch. It had been just one day since Dr. Mazur diagnosed Jen, and she was already feeling much better. Dr. Mazur prescribed some antibiotics that were working well, and for the first time in over a week, Jen didn't feel nauseous. She could finally keep food down, but she was scared to eat anything that came from inside her house, because it might contain the deadly microorganism. Jen looked on as the employees pulled fruit, vegetables, cheeses, and meats out of the refrigerator. They took small samples of each item and sealed them inside of small labeled baggies. Jen heard them tell her parents that they would test the samples and let them know the results as soon as possible. Dennis and Sherry thanked them, and then the employees left. As soon as they were gone, Jen's dad walked into the kitchen and took all the food out of the fridge and out of the freezer and just dumped it into a trash bag, went into the backyard, and threw it away. When he came back inside, he told Jen they'd just go grocery shopping for new food tomorrow. That way they would know for sure that whatever they bought was safe to eat. At the Minnesota Health Department, Larry Edmondson had collected hundreds of food samples from the homes of people who had gotten sick. Now, microbiologists were hard at work testing those samples to determine which, if any, contained the deadly microorganism causing all the illness. Larry entered the lab to find 2 analysts staring down at a line of petri dishes. They looked up when they heard him come in, and he asked them for an update on their progress. And one of the analysts said that Larry's timing actually couldn't be any better, because they had just found something he needed to see. Larry immediately rushed over to them to see what they were talking about. He knew that each of these petri dishes contained a swab from the food samples that the health department had collected. The lab analysts were watching all of them for signs of this microorganism, and all of these samples currently looked normal, except for one, which had grown a whole bunch of small black circles all over the sample. Larry's eyes widened when he saw it, because those black circles were a telltale sign of this deadly microorganism. He asked the analysts which food that sample came from, and they said it was from ice cream. Larry quickly reviewed the records from his investigation, and the truth dawned on him. Every person who had fallen ill had recently eaten ice cream from a company called Schwann's. and now the health department had proof that this ice cream contained this deadly microorganism. Larry almost wanted to cheer, but he reminded himself that this was not really a time to celebrate. He was sure that the company, Schwann's, had no idea their ice cream was poisoning people, so Larry would have to call them right away. A few days later, Larry sat in his office at the Minnesota Health Department feeling very frustrated. This case just kept getting more difficult. When Larry had called the ice cream company, Schwann's, he learned something very concerning. Schwann's ice cream was not typically sold in grocery stores. Instead, it was delivered directly to customers' doors all across the United States. Now, Larry still knew nothing about 14-year-old Jen Thompson's severe illness out in Idaho, but he now understood that this disease outbreak likely went far beyond Minnesota. On the bright side, though, Schwann's had been extremely cooperative. As soon as they learned their ice cream was tainted, they shut down their factory and recalled all of the potentially contaminated products. Schwann's delivery drivers were going door to door across the nation, informing customers of this outbreak and collecting tainted ice cream. But the Minnesota Health Department still hadn't figured out how the microorganism got into the ice cream in the first place. And that was the only way to prevent this disaster from happening again. Larry read over a report from one of his colleagues. They had swabbed miles of stainless steel piping at the company's giant manufacturing plant, but none contained any trace of this microorganism that sickened all the teens. So where was it coming from? Minnesota officials had expanded their investigation to include the company's distribution system, and so Larry's coworkers were now analyzing the company's trucks, trying to see if maybe the product was contaminated during shipping. Just then, Larry's phone rang, and he picked it up, hoping it would be one of his colleagues with good news. But it wasn't. When Larry answered, he heard a man's nervous voice, and this man said he had a tip about the department's ongoing food safety investigation, but this man was calling from a payphone because he wanted to stay anonymous. When Larry heard this, he sat upright, pressing the phone hard against his ear. He told the man that was fine. Larry didn't need his name, he just needed whatever information he had. So the man whispered that he was a truck driver, and the company he worked for shipped two kinds of cargo: bulk ice cream for Schwann's and unpasteurized liquid eggs. The driver said that the same trucks could carry liquid eggs one day and ice cream the next. And then in between, the refrigerated cargo tanks on the back of the trucks were supposed to be thoroughly cleaned so that there was no contamination from one load to the next. But the tipster said one driver had not been given the right cleaning supplies to disinfect their vehicle after hauling thousands of gallons of liquid eggs. So bacteria from the unpasteurized eggs contaminated the entire truck. And so as soon as the Schwann's ice cream was loaded into that truck, the ice cream got contaminated. Larry thanked the driver for coming forward. Because of him, the Minnesota Health Department could finally close this case. Larry immediately went to his supervisors and told them the whole story. When that cargo truck wasn't cleaned properly, it turned into a giant incubator for a type of deadly bacteria found in unpasteurized eggs called salmonella. The salmonella bacteria then mixed with a giant shipment of Schwann's vanilla ice cream. And so after 14-year-old Jen Thompson got home from the county fair on Sunday, February 18th, 1994, she did her math homework, she ate her dinner, then right before bed, she ate a bowl of the contaminated Schwann's vanilla ice cream. And so, of course, she and her parents had no idea that her dessert was full of salmonella bacteria. And so as a result, Jen just kept eating more and more of this contaminated ice cream each time she felt sick, because it was really the only food she could actually stomach. And so as this bacteria continued to multiply inside of her body, she got sicker and sicker. Jen and her family had no idea the ice cream was behind her illness until sometime in mid-October, when a Schwann's delivery driver came to their door and asked to take the contaminated ice cream back. The Schwann's salmonella contamination was one of the biggest mass poisonings in American history. In total, there were 593 confirmed cases of salmonella poisoning across 41 states and as many as 5,000 suspected cases nationwide. However, some experts estimate that there may have been nearly 225,000 people who got sick from this tainted ice cream. They just didn't report it. The ice cream company, Schwann's, paid out thousands of settlements to victims and changed their shipping procedure to make sure this contamination could never happen again. As for why the illness predominantly struck teenagers, it was likely due to two factors. One, young people tend to eat more ice cream, and two, young people tend to be more shy or embarrassed to talk about gastrointestinal issues than their more senior counterparts. And so as a result, maybe they began having symptoms and could have gone to the doctor and dealt with them, but in fear of being embarrassed, they didn't go to the doctor and let this condition get worse and worse and worse, and then finally it turned into a full-blown emergency room visit. But very few of the people who got salmonella poisoning had symptoms as severe as 14-year-old Jen Thompson. Even after having her appendix removed, she had to undergo at least 3 more surgeries to fix her damaged digestive system, including having her gallbladder taken out. The salmonella also caused her to develop a rare type of arthritis. To this day, Jen still lives with chronic pain, all because of a few bowls of ice cream she ate back in 1994. On a warm Nebraska evening in late September 2012, 36-year-old Dave Krupa left work feeling better than he had in weeks. He was thinking about the woman he had met that afternoon in the auto body shop where he worked. Dave had been helping another customer when this woman arrived, but as soon as he saw her, he completely forgot about what he was doing and just stared. Her name was Carrie Farber. She was 5 foot 7 inches tall, she was slender and tanned with light brown hair, and she had hazel eyes and a dazzling smile. Dave had suddenly felt like he was right back in high school, all thumbs as he handed change to the customer standing in front of her. Then, Carrie stepped to the counter, gave Dave a friendly nod, and told him her black Ford Explorer needed some minor but immediate maintenance work. As they arranged for Carrie to bring her car right then into the service area, Dave had felt an instant sense of ease and attraction between the two of them. The last 6 months had been difficult for Dave, and unexpected moments like this one were very welcome. Dave had moved to Omaha, Nebraska from his home state of Iowa 5 months earlier in April after he and his longtime girlfriend Amy had both agreed it was time to end their 10-year-long relationship. And once he had arrived in Nebraska, he'd been offered a manager job at this Hyatt Tire auto body shop. The oldest of 3 brothers born to deeply religious Southern Baptist parents, Dave had worked hard at being a good boyfriend and provider and a great dad. He and his ex-girlfriend Amy had parted on friendly terms and worked out a custody arrangement so Dave could see their 2 children a couple times a week. But even so, his small, barely furnished apartment not far from the auto body shop had felt depressing. And since Dave had been in this very serious relationship for the last decade, he had arrived in this new city without any idea how to re-enter the dating scene. He had signed up for a dating website called Plenty of Fish within a few weeks of his arrival in town, and over the summer he had in fact gone on maybe a dozen dates with several women he had met online. But seeing this woman, Carrie, in his auto shop was different. It was the first time in a long time Dave had met someone the old-fashioned way, through a chance in-person encounter rather than by surfing pictures and descriptions posted on the Plenty of Fish website. Now, as Dave walked away from the auto shop over to where his car was parked in the lot to head home for the night, he wished that he had just asked Carrie out on a date when he had a chance to earlier in the day. But at the same time, he thought to himself, it would have been unprofessional or maybe even inappropriate for him to be asking a customer out. And after all, maybe he had just imagined that the attraction he had felt was mutual. Dave climbed into his car, turned the key, and started up the engine. And as he pulled out of the lot, he thought to himself, maybe if Carrie was actually interested in him, she'd come back. 2 weeks after meeting Carrie, while Dave was scrolling through profiles on Plenty of Fish, he suddenly felt a rush of excitement. Right there on the screen in front of him was Carrie's picture. Her hair was a little bit different, but the eyes and the smile were the same. She was 37 years old, and she lived an hour away in her hometown of Macedonia, Iowa, and she worked at a computer programming company in Omaha, just a block from Dave's apartment. She was beautiful, and, most importantly, she was available. Dave remembered that sense of mutual attraction he believed they had felt in the auto body shop, and so he typed out a message. "Hey, I know you." He waited for a minute, then kept on scrolling through other profiles, but he wasn't really looking anymore. He was just hoping to hear the ping of an incoming reply. And he didn't have to wait long. "Hey," her text to him read, "I know you too." And over the next 2 weeks, Dave and Carrie would text each other almost every day. And then, about 1 month after Carrie's first visit to the Hyatt Tire Auto Body Shop, she made a second visit, claiming that her windows were sticking. Standing next to each other in the parking lot, Dave did not even wait to write up the service order. He just immediately asked Carrie if she wanted to go out with him. Carrie said yes, and the next evening, Carrie and Dave were sitting across from each other at the Applebee's Bar and Grill at the Omaha Oakview Mall. And it was great. It was clear that both Carrie and Dave had been thinking about each other over the past month, and now that they were together, Dave found Carrie not only beautiful, but very smart and funny as well. For her part, Carrie found Dave, a former football player who had also served in the National Guard before getting his associate's degree in automotive engineering, attractive and engaging. Carrie liked that Dave was a down-to-earth blue-collar guy who worked with his hands. They were also both single parents who were very involved with their children. They both liked to read and talk about books, they both had busy jobs, and neither of them wanted to take life too seriously. A few hours later, Carrie and Dave walked into Dave's apartment, the air between them electric, but before they could even settle in together on the couch, they jumped when they heard the sound of someone knocking on the door. Annoyed, Dave got up from the couch and walked over to the door, and when he looked through the peephole, he wasn't all that surprised at who he saw standing on the other side. Her name was Liz Gollier. She was an attractive, energetic 37-year-old single mom who ran her own house cleaning business, and she was the first woman Dave had dated since he had arrived in Omaha. Liz and Dave had found each other physically attractive and had had some fun times together, but over the last couple of months, it was clear to both of them that their relationship was really just fizzling out. Earlier that night, while Dave was at Applebee's with Carrie, Liz had texted him asking if she could come by his apartment that evening and just pick up some of her belongings that she had left there. Dave had ignored her, and so wanting to get this over with, Liz had decided to swing by anyways. From Dave's perspective, Liz's timing could not have been worse, and he wished he had just responded to her earlier messages to tell her, hey, come by another day, but he didn't, so here they were in this awkward situation. Before opening the door, Dave turned and briefly explained the situation to Carrie, who was still on the couch, and Carrie appeared to handle the situation well, and she stood up like she was going to leave. Dave then proceeded to open the door and said hello to Liz, and Liz, who saw Carrie, instantly recognized the situation she had just interrupted, and so she turned red in the face and she apologized, and then she just kind of stood there in the doorway not doing anything. Carrie grabbed her bag and looked over at Dave and said, "Give me a call when you get this sorted out," and then she walked out of his apartment. Neither woman acknowledged the other. However, Liz thought she heard Carrie say, "bitch," under her breath as she passed her. Once Carrie was gone, Dave told Liz to come inside, get your things. Liz felt horrible and kept apologizing as she moved around the apartment, getting what she needed, but Dave really wasn't listening to her. He just wanted her to leave so he could call Carrie and see if they could maybe still meet up that night. Dave had always been right up front with every woman he dated. He was only interested in casual sex and general companionship. He was not interested in getting married, ever. And in fact, this was the main reason why he was here in Omaha and not back in Council Bluffs, Iowa. His ex-girlfriend, Amy, had finally said to him that if he was not going to propose to her, he needed to leave. And so Dave left. After Liz finally had all of her things, she said a quick goodbye to Dave, and then she too hustled out the door. As soon as she was gone, Dave shut the door and then pulled out his cell phone and dialed Carrie's number. Carrie's 14-year-old son, Max, was staying overnight out of the house with Carrie's parents, so when Dave asked Carrie if it was still early enough for him to maybe come over, Carrie immediately said yes. Once Dave arrived, the two of them quickly became intimate, but before heading to the bedroom, it was Carrie, not Dave, who stepped back and said that he should know up front that she was not interested in a serious or exclusive relationship. Dave could not believe his luck. He felt like he had hit the jackpot. Over the next week, Carrie and Dave saw each other every chance they got. Carrie stopped in at Hyatt Tire, Carrie asked for Dave's help in finding her son a used car, Carrie took Dave thrift shopping and started to upgrade the furnishings in Dave's apartment, replacing his broken-down couch with a comfortable silver love seat. And then, when that week was at an end and Carrie got a big assignment at work, she eagerly accepted Dave's offer to live at his apartment for the following week so she could save 2 hours of commuting time each day. Carrie's son Max would stay with his grandparents. That week they lived together, Dave and Carrie quickly began using pet names for one another, and every morning while he was getting ready for work, Dave would find himself smiling as he listened to the sound of Carrie typing and clicking away on her laptop as she checked her email and Facebook account in the other room. On the morning of November 13th, 2012, so just a couple of days into living together in Dave's apartment, Dave got ready for work and then walked over to Carrie, who was still wearing her pajamas and was sitting on the silver love seat she had picked out for him. He gave her a kiss, which she enthusiastically returned, and then he smiled at her and said that he would see her later on, and then he stepped out into the cold. By 6:20 a.m., he was pulling out of the parking lot, making his way to work. A few hours later, at 10 a.m., Dave, who was working on a car at the auto body shop, received a text from Carrie asking him if he wanted to live together permanently. Now, Dave understood that he and Carrie had definitely gotten really close, but at the same time, he had been really clear with Carrie about not wanting a serious relationship. That is what made their week together fun, because it was temporary. He didn't like the idea of making it anything more than that, and he was thinking, Carrie made the same claim to him, that she didn't want anything serious. And so he responded to her very quickly with a text that just said, "No, not interested," thinking he would talk to Carrie later when it wasn't so busy at work. But just 20 seconds after sending that response text, Dave received an angry text message from Carrie breaking off the relationship completely. Her text said, "Fine, I hate you. I'm dating someone else and I don't want to see you anymore." And when Dave got home that night, it looked like Carrie had made good on her threat. Right down to her toothbrush, all of her things that were in Dave's apartment were now gone. Dave was shaken, but it didn't take long for reality to set in. He'd been on dates with other women who had agreed, in theory, to casual, non-exclusive relationships, only to change their minds after a couple of dates. And so this seemed like that type of situation that, Carrie was revealing how she actually felt. And so it wasn't long before Dave's shock gave way to relief. It was probably for the best that this ended now. But it turned out that Carrie was not done with Dave, at least not yet. Within 2 days, Dave's phone started blowing up with texts and emails from Carrie. She may have taken her things out of Dave's apartment, but it was instantly clear that she was not going to leave him alone. At first, the messages were angry and jealous. Carrie hated him. He had ruined her life. He was a terrible person. And even though Carrie told him she had quit her job at the computer company, which was down the road from Dave, it was clear from some of these text messages that she had to still be close by. One very creepy text Dave received said, "My favorite thing to do is to stand outside and stare at you."
Every glance, every smile burns my soul. All the while, insecurity runs wild. Trust is gone, feeling raw. Jealousy tearing me apart. Green-eyed monster in.
It wasn't long before the tone of these messages and emails shifted from vindictive and insulting to blatantly threatening. "I hate you so much that I want to drive a knife into your heart," read one message. "I will destroy your life and take your happiness," read another. And more of the texts seemed aimed not only at Dave, but also at Liz, the woman who had shown up at Dave's place on the night of Carrie and Dave's first date. One text Dave received from Carrie said, "Liz was a fat, ugly whore who deserved to die." And not long after that, Liz would actually call Dave to tell him that Carrie was sending her directly these vulgar and threatening text messages and emails. Within 2 weeks of the breakup, Dave and Liz were receiving dozens of texts and hang-up calls, as well as 50 or more emails every single day from Carrie. By November 23rd, 10 days after the breakup, Liz had had enough. She had walked into her garage that morning only to find the words "whore from Dave" spray painted on the wall. Liz immediately contacted the Omaha Police Department to report the vandalism, along with her suspicion that Carrie Farver was the person behind the property damage, given the harassing messages she and Dave had been receiving. But the police really couldn't do much about it because they couldn't find Carrie. After she broke up with Dave on November 13th, she had vanished. It was believed she was in hiding somewhere to avoid being arrested for all of the stalking she was doing. So the texts and emails just kept coming in, including disturbing messages that sounded like this. "Dave, I can see you. You're sitting in your chair with your feet propped up. You're wearing a blue shirt." Ironically, this horrible situation actually brought Dave and Liz together again because there was no one else who would understand what they were going through. They had tried to get the police involved, but there just wasn't much they could do, and so Dave and Liz had just begun to accept that this was their life. And while it might seem unimaginable to other people, to them, it had just become a new and horrible kind of normal. It was not uncommon for them to be sitting on the couch together when they would both suddenly receive a barrage of text messages from Carrie. Meanwhile, the Omaha Police Department wasn't the only law enforcement agency that had been made aware of Carrie Farver. On November 16th, so that's 3 days after the breakup, Carrie's mother, Nancy, had filed a missing persons report with the Macedonia Police Department in Iowa. When the police eventually followed up on the report by talking with Dave, Dave felt like he finally understood how Carrie, who had seemed so put together and independent when he had first met her, could have changed seemingly overnight into this crazy stalker person. The police would tell Dave that Carrie had a mental health condition called bipolar disorder, which can cause violent and sudden mood swings and bouts of depression, alternating with episodes of mania where its sufferers behave in erratic and unpredictable ways. But despite that adding some clarity to the situation, it didn't actually do anything to help Dave or Liz. They were still just getting non-stop harassed by Carrie. No matter how many times they changed their phone numbers and opened new email accounts, Carrie, with her vast knowledge of computers and technology, always found a way to find them again and continue cyberstalking them. As for Carrie, since going missing on November 13th, she had blown off a family wedding, her son's birthday, and even her own father's funeral, apologizing by text and email to her family, but asking that they leave her alone because she needed some space. In January 2013, so a couple of months after the breakup, Omaha police thought maybe they'd gotten a break in the Carrie Farver case when Dave spotted her black Ford Explorer in a parking lot near his apartment. But the inside of the car was wiped clean, and the only item of interest was a metal container of mints with a single fingerprint on them that did not match with that of any known criminal. At that point, Dave and Liz willingly turned over their phones to law enforcement for examination, but police found nothing on them that would help them close in on Carrie. Still, as long as there was a missing person report on Carrie Farver, police could not close the case until they had located her. In the summer of that year, both Dave and Liz attempted once again to try to move on with their respective lives. At the end of the summer, Liz and her 2 children planned to move out of their rented house and move in with a former boyfriend, and Dave started spending more time with his kids back in Iowa. But the harassment continued. When Dave received an email from Carrie threatening to kill Liz and showing a photo of a woman tied up in the trunk of a car, Dave called Liz, who assured him she was not the woman in the picture and that she was okay. But Liz was not okay for very long. On August 17th of that year, so 9 months after Dave and Carrie had broken up, someone set fire to Liz's rented house. And while Liz and her children were not inside the house when it burned, all 4 of the family's pets were killed. When she checked her email later that day, Liz saw there was one from Carrie that had been sent just a few hours before the fire had started. And it said, "I hope you and your children burn to death." Liz was terrified and absolutely beside herself. She had struggled through a terrible childhood, losing both of her parents by the time she was just 3 years old, and then she had grown up in the foster care system, and now everything that she had managed to build up in her life was being destroyed. Her housekeeping business was failing, her boyfriend had to help her with the bills, and her children were in danger, all because of Carrie, a woman she didn't even know. Dave, racked with guilt over involving Liz in this mess, now feared for his own family. He began to drink more heavily and he purchased a gun. Even as the police continued their investigation, the intrusions into Dave's life didn't just continue, they intensified. The auto body shop where Dave worked was vandalized. In January of 2014, while Dave was in his apartment with a date, his door handle was shaken from the outside and then a brick was thrown through his window. Dave's ex-girlfriend, Amy Flora, the mother of his 2 children, had also received threatening messages from Carrie. It seemed like anyone involved in Dave's life was becoming a target. Then, in 2015, the Carrie Farver case blew wide open. Since losing her home and pets in the fire 2 years earlier, Liz had been doing a lot of thinking. Even as she continued to receive texts, emails from Carrie, Liz wondered if maybe there was someone else behind the attacks. It just didn't make sense to her that the police had not found Carrie, and that Carrie would still be going after Liz, who was not even in any kind of serious relationship with Dave. So on December 4th of that year, Liz got in her car and drove to the Pottawatomie County Sheriff's Office in Council Bluffs, Iowa, and there she told a new team of investigators who had already started to review all of the files in the Carrie Farber case that she wanted to file a restraining order, not against Carrie Farber, but against Amy Flora, Dave's ex-girlfriend and the mother of his kids. When asked why, she told investigators she now believed that the person who had been sending her and Dave these thousands of text messages and emails and who had turned their lives into living hells was not Carrie Farber, but Amy Flora. And Liz believed that Carrie was not on the run or in hiding, but rather Amy had likely made Carrie disappear and then taken over all of her email and phone accounts. Liz knew this was a very serious allegation, but to her it made a lot of sense. After Dave had left her, Amy had the strongest motivation to seek revenge and to punish him for abandoning her and their children. Intrigued, the investigators asked Liz if they could download the contents of her cell phone and review all of the messages to date that were on there, and Liz immediately agreed. After nearly 3 years of this absolute madness, she was finally feeling hopeful that the police might actually put an end to it. However, Liz's nightmare was about to get a whole lot worse. At 6:42 p.m. the very next day, on the evening of December 5th, police received a frantic 911 call from the Big Lake Park in Council Falls, Iowa. It was Liz. When the police and an ambulance arrived, Liz was lying in this huge pool of blood right next to her car, and she would tell investigators that she had been sitting at a bench a little ways away when someone had come up behind her and they had jabbed a gun into her back, but she didn't recognize it as a gun. She thought someone had poked her. And so she kind of stood up and turned around to see what they were doing, and then they fired their gun at her, narrowly missing her midsection. The bullet had gone into her thigh and then also narrowly missed her bone and major arteries, and this gunman had turned and just ran away. Liz would say it was too dark to get a good look at who the shooter was. However, she was reasonably certain it was a woman, and so she told investigators it had to be Amy Flora. Who else would shoot her? At 7 p.m. that night, police arrived on Amy's doorstep with guns drawn, and they took her into the station for questioning. And despite insisting that she had been home with her kids all evening, Amy failed the lie detector test. But since they could not break Amy's alibi, the police had to let her go. On December 7th, so 3 days after the shooting, the police requested the cell phones belonging to Dave Krupa and Amy Flora. And then about 2 weeks later, using that information they had pulled from those phones, amongst other evidence they had collected, the police finally felt like they had reached a conclusion. And so they called Liz into the station, who by now was still very badly hurt from the gunshot wound, but now she was able to walk around on crutches, and they asked her if she'd be willing to help them bring Amy Flora to justice. Like Liz had previously suggested when she went to file a restraining order against Amy, the police now believed that Carrie had in fact been murdered, and her identity then used to perpetrate a 3-year-long campaign of harassment and intimidation against Dave and Liz. But to make the charges stick, they needed incriminating evidence, and they wanted Liz to reach out to Amy via email or text to see if Amy would give up any information. After they promised a terrified Liz that she would have full protection from them, she agreed to help. And sure enough, after only a few email exchanges, Liz got Amy so angry and riled up that she started talking about what she had done, and Liz just forwarded these messages to the police. And in these forwarded messages, Amy admitted to shooting Liz, almost like she was trying to brag about it. And shockingly, Amy also admitted to having killed Carrie, saying that she had died inside of her own black Ford Explorer. And sure enough, a second examination of Carrie's black Ford Explorer would lead investigators to find blood under the seats that belonged to Carrie. Police also found a match for that unknown fingerprint on the metal container of mints that was inside of Carrie's car. With all of this new evidence, it was now crystal clear who had killed Carrie and then relentlessly persecuted Dave and Liz. And that person was not Amy Flora. It was Liz. 8 months later, on December 22nd, 2016, in a case that would make national headlines, police arrested 41-year-old Liz Gollier for first-degree murder in the death of Carrie Farver. Liz was also charged with second-degree arson in the deliberate destruction of her rented house where she lived and where all 4 of her children's pets were burned to death. When investigators had downloaded the contents of cell phones and memory cards belonging to Liz, Dave, and Amy, along with the data from Dave's devices that Liz had access to, all the awful emails and text messages in the last 3 years, more than 60,000 of them, had IP addresses that could all be traced back to Liz. Most incriminating of all were pictures belonging to Liz that appeared to show Carrie's decomposing foot, identifiable because of the distinctive tattoo that was still visible across the bridge of the foot. It would turn out that Liz Gollier's obsession with Dave Krupa began almost immediately after their first date back in late spring of 2012. And by the time she passed Carrie Farver in Dave's apartment doorway during that awkward meeting, Liz knew any chance of a serious relationship with Dave was slipping out of reach. The text that Dave received from Carrie's phone on the morning of November 13th at around 10 a.m. about wanting to move in together permanently, and every harassing and threatening text, email, and suspicious phone call that he, Amy, and Carrie's family would receive over the next 3.5 years would all be the work of Liz Gollier. Using more than 30 different imposter email accounts, along with an app that allowed her to schedule the release of texts and emails so they arrived while she was actually with Dave, prosecutors estimated that Liz would eventually spend 40 to 50 hours every week impersonating Carrie Farver and using Carrie's own Facebook account to create the illusion that Carrie was in fact still alive. The ongoing drama would force Dave to reach out to Liz, and every time he began to pull away, she would just ratchet up the pressure and guilt Dave for bringing Carrie into Liz's life, first with acts of vandalism like spray painting her own garage wall, and later with more violent attacks, setting fire to her own home, throwing a brick through Dave's apartment window, vandalizing the auto store, and then finally shooting herself in the leg. When Dave showed a renewed interest in his ex-girlfriend Amy and told Liz he planned to move back in with her in 2016, Liz made a last-ditch attempt to derail that romance and divert attention by framing Amy for the crimes Liz herself had committed. But by late 2015, Liz would get hopelessly entangled in her own lies. By the time she walked into the police station to ask for a restraining order against Amy, police already completely suspected Liz, who seemed way too involved in every aspect of the Carrie Farver case. Even though Amy had failed the lie detector test when she was questioned about shooting Liz, Amy was actually never a serious suspect, and her alibi was unbreakable. But by pretending to ask for Liz's help in incriminating Amy, police were able to push Liz into revealing her own deceptions. Although Carrie's body was never found, the evidence and testimony presented by prosecutors at Liz Gollier's trial paint a sad and grisly picture of Carrie Farver's last moments. 3 years earlier, after Dave had kissed Carrie goodbye and stepped out into the cold morning air of November 13th, 2012, Carrie would finish her coffee, close up her laptop, and get herself ready for work. Once she was ready, she too stepped out into the cold morning air to head into her office. And when Carrie got into her black Ford Explorer in the parking lot, Liz Gollier, who likely had been hiding and waiting nearby, just waiting for Carrie to come outside, rushed over to her vehicle and somehow convinced Carrie to let her get inside with her. And then shortly after Liz was in the passenger seat, she pulled out a knife and reached across the center console and stabbed Carrie repeatedly in the stomach, at least 3 or 4 times. It's believed Carrie knew she was going to die and began pleading with Liz to allow her to call her family to at least say goodbye. But Liz just said no and restrained her until she bled to death. Afterward, Liz took Carrie's keys and went into Dave's apartment and took all of Carrie's things out so it would look like she had left him, and then Liz drove Carrie's car, with Carrie's body inside of it, to some unknown location where she pulled Carrie's body out, burned it, and then disposed of it in a dumpster. Then Liz wiped Carrie's car down to remove any evidence. However, she didn't realize she had left lots of Carrie's blood underneath the seats, as well as her own fingerprint on that mint can. Liz Gollier is currently serving a life sentence at the Nebraska Correctional Center for Women, 107 miles southwest of Omaha, where she first met Dave Krupa.
My heart, I'm falling fast, can't restart. Wish I knew what's the right part. Whisper soft, but they sting. In my mind, they always cling. Hurts to see you in her ring. Love's become this painful thing. I want to believe it's just a phase. Wishing thoughts would somehow fade. But I see her in your gaze, breaking down in countless ways. Can we find solid ground? In this storm, can we be sound? Need your love to wrap around. Let this chaos be unbound. Ooh.
Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please offer to buy the 5-star review button a 20-piece chicken nugget from McDonald's, but only give them one half-used ranch dipping sauce to go with it. Also, please subscribe to the Mr. Ballin podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories I have posted on my YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballin. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username on all platforms is just @MrBallin, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Lastly, we have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballin.com to have a look. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support.